First up, James Forsyth writes in this week's cover piece that Boris Johnson is looking to get the gang back together for one last Brexit bust-up. The Prime Minister, he says, wants to tear up parts of the Brexit deal because of problems with trade between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And he may be willing to throw away the whole agreement to do it. Where's this going? And how serious might the fallout be? James, our political editor, joins me now alongside Lord Frost, the former Brexit minister. James, in your cover piece this week, you write about a plan the government has when it comes to the Queen's speech next week to reopen the Brexit debate. Can you tell us more?
Yeah, so in the Queen's speech next week, the government will talk about the importance of protecting the Good Friday Agreement in its entirety. And what this is code for is a warning to the EU that the UK is ultimately prepared to legislate to override parts of the Northern Ireland Protocol to protect the Good Friday Agreement. Now, the government's argument is that there are three strands to the Good Friday Agreement, and all three of them are in trouble right now. The DUP pulled out of the devolved power-sharing executive in February and have been very clear that they won't go back into it until their concerns about the protocol have been addressed. There is no north-south ministerial cooperation at the moment, and the DUP's whole issue with the protocol is that they think that it hinders east-west ties. And so the government will say that it is prepared to do this. Ministers are increasingly convinced that this would be legal under international law because they argue that they are merely moving to protect the pre-existing international agreement, Good Friday. And so that gives them legal cover to do what they want. Now, I think the big question here is whether it ever comes to legislation or not. This isn't the first time that Boris Johnson has tried to use domestic legislation to shift the EU's negotiating position. Think back to the internal market bill. And I think what the UK government is saying is to the EU, you've got one last chance to come to the table and move beyond a kind of very technical negotiation about the protocol to a broader one about how it should work. And if you won't do that, the UK is prepared to take matters into its own hands.
David, you obviously led on this, and as well as being the lead Brexit negotiator, were in charge of the protocol before leaving government. What did you make on hearing about this plan? Was that something you were aware of, was in the making before you left?
So I think it is a sensible plan. I think the protocol, it was a delicately balanced instrument created in very difficult circumstances. It hasn't had good handling since we left the EU and the transition period. I think the Good Friday Agreement is on life support now, really, and I don't see that the government has got any other choice other than to act itself. Now, I agree with James that I think it would still be much better if we could agree a revised set of arrangements with the EU. And I still find it slightly surprising the EU won't do this when it seems very obviously in the wider interest. So I think it's right, if that's the government's plan, to give it another go. But they can't take very long about it. It really does have to be a kind of ultimatum. And if not, I think the government's got no other choice than to act. It's obvious the protocol's got to change or be replaced. The only question is how we get there.
James, why are the talks going nowhere? You say in your cover piece that Liz Truss has brought a new approach to it in terms of tone, perhaps being softer in her approach and less confrontational than her predecessor, who is also in this conversation. But yet that doesn't seem to be bringing any new response from the EU whatsoever.
Yes, as one figure on the British side said to me after Liz Truss took over, the atmosphere in the room keeps getting better, but we're not getting any further forward. I think the problem is that the EU, the protocol was meant to do two things. It was meant to protect the Good Friday Agreement and the integrity of the single market. I think, frankly, the problem is that for most EU member states, protecting the integrity of the single market is the more important of those two priorities. And that leads to some very legalistic approaches to enforcement that I think that go beyond what is required. For example, we haven't had the protocol fully enforced in the last 2 years. There have been grace periods. I don't think you could say that the integrity of a single market has been destroyed by those grace periods. So why not make them permanent? That would be, I think, a decent basis on which to start a new discussion. And I think the other issue is, what the EU worries about is not the situation now where UK and EU regulations are still pretty much aligned, but what happens in 10, 20 years' time when there's been more divergence. Could this open border on the island of Ireland become a kind of backdoor into a single market? I personally think that this risk has been exaggerated, as you've seen during the grace periods. We haven't seen lots of goods flowing into the Republic from the north as contraband. That's not the case. I also think you look at things like, for example, the fact that if the government decided to remove VAT from domestic energy bills, that couldn't apply in Northern Ireland because of the protocol. It's hard to think that allowing people's home heating bills to not have sales tax on them in Northern Ireland is a threat to the integrity of a single market.
David, what do you make of Liz Truss's performance so far?
So I think she's done a good job. I think she's picked it up and basically pushed the same things that I was pushing, as far as I can see. And obviously her style's been a bit different to mine. But in the end, negotiations are not about style or warm feelings. They're about interests. And you have to be absolutely clear about what your interests are and be clear about what will work for you and what won't. And the brutal reality is that the EU have never put anything on the table that adequately responds to what we put on the table as a reform proposal last year. They've tinkered around the edges. They've never really grappled with the complexity of the problems that have now emerged. And everyone can see that, and that's one of the reasons why we're in the current position. Of course they can say, what we have we hold. You agreed this, stick to it. But you have to look at the real world, and the real world is that things are deteriorating fast. And unfortunately, the EU is not generally a nimble negotiator. They tend to take positions and stick to it, and that's what we've seen. That has got to change, and it is very difficult to push the EU into changing positions. One of the things that you often have to do is raise the stakes. And perhaps this is what the government is trying to do with these latest proposals.
Now, we know the EU position is effectively to say, well, it's you guys who agreed to this, you signed this, and we don't want to retrospectively change something, which both sides agreed to. So, James, if we go along with this idea that the EU will not budge and the government go through with this plan, what can we expect in terms of the next steps and potential retaliation?
So I think the EU's plan is to say very little after the Queen's speech. I think the EU's view is that, words in the Queen's speech don't necessarily amount to action. And also there is a view on the EU side that, that Boris Johnson would like a fight with the EU right now because of his domestic political situation, and so they're not going to give him one. I think things change if the bill is actually introduced into Parliament. I think at that point the EU will unfreeze the legal proceedings against the UK for not having enforced the protocol. And I also think it will be made clear that the UK will not be allowed to join Horizon, the EU's scientific research programme. I think if the bill was to then proceed through Parliament and become law, then I think the EU would, the EU side want to say that the kind of nuclear option of directly targeting British products, tariffs on politically sensitive goods and the like, that would come into play. Now, I think that the question is, some on the British side think that in the current geopolitical circumstances, there will be more voices than previously kind of urging restraint on the EU side, saying, look, we don't want to get into a trade war at this moment in time, given everything that is happening in Ukraine, and the closeness of the links at the moment between the UK and the Eastern European countries and the Balts.
David, do you think we could be heading to a full-blown trade war?
Well, I mean, just for a moment on the domestic politics of this, I think there obviously is a Brexit coalition that has supported Boris Johnson, taken him to this place, pushed through Brexit and so on within the parliamentary party and beyond. I don't think you can necessarily extrapolate from that and say that Boris Johnson welcomes a massive argument with the EU with all the risks that go with it, particularly when it's over Northern Ireland. I think it's something that he feels he has to do. We're pushed into a position where there's no real alternative, and fundamentals like the sovereignty of the country are at stake. I don't think it's a political tactic. I think it's sort of something that's fundamentally important. So I do think that needs to be kept in mind as well. And one of the things the EU have often done is misinterpret as political tactics things which are actually fundamental to the world view and things that we want to get done. On the question of retaliation, is obviously possible. I think it would be extraordinary if the EU were to retaliate in a major way in the trade area while current events are going on. I think it would be a massive weakening of the West generally, and for that reason I don't think they're going to. I think we probably will see some measures if the government pushes this through, but honestly I wonder whether the heart is going to be there in every member state to do this and push through when Britain is such a leading player in the coalition and in a conflict that, let's face it, could go on for some time yet.
Now, James, David just touched on the political implications, and obviously being the case that this is not just Boris Johnson doing it for his own political safety, but could you perhaps explain to viewers why there could be some self-interest here in terms of what it means for Boris Johnson's position? I mean, we're talking on Thursday ahead of the local election results, but given Partygate and local elections, Sugo report, everyone expects the Prime Minister to be in for a bumpy few weeks. So is the idea that this could play to his right flank?
Yeah, there are certainly Brexiteer Tory MPs who are frustrated with Boris Johnson, but they stay their hand against him because they say, look, we don't think that any of his potential successors would be prepared to see this issue through, to take the risks that are involved in this kind of brinksmanship. So I think there is. I'm not saying it is the driving factor, but there is clearly an element of domestic politics, domestic party politics, party management involved here too. I think that the biggest thing is that it is very hard to see, if not impossible, how you can get the power sharing executive in Northern Ireland up and running without changes to the protocol. But I think that you can see, though, that Boris Johnson politically has always been at his strongest when he has managed to kind of rally the forces of Leave to him, both within and without the Tory party.
And just on that, James, then I'll come to David on this, before we talk about the legality and those who will be friends to the UK and those who will not, if the government goes ahead. Do you think that this would rally Brexit voters, not just Brexit MPs? Because ultimately, if it does end up in this worst case scenario where the EU has to go ahead with it, the EU retaliates, and you start to see significant disruption to trade, lots of people could start to think, well, Brexit actually isn't done, despite the Prime Minister telling us it was, and it was going to be.
Yeah, I think this is the biggest risk. I think there are two big risks for Boris Johnson. First of all, frankly, voters in Britain tend not to care that much about Northern Ireland. Look at how little discussion there was of the protocol during the 2019 general election campaign, for example. I think the second risk is that in 2019, the Tories stood on, stop the arguing, get Brexit done. People were fed up with hearing about it. They wanted it over with, done, finished. I think it would be politically risky to turn around to people and say, actually, that thing we told you was done isn't done because we've still got this outstanding issue to deal with. I mean that there are clear political risks in that.
David, do you agree with that? I mean, of course, you were a key player in getting Boris Johnson to the point where he could promise Brexit would be done.
I mean, there obviously are risks. If there's serious retaliation, who knows? But there are also opportunities, and I think Boris is at his strongest not only when he's talking about Brexit, but when he's articulating conservative principles that the party believes in. And if the integrity of the nation state, the integrity of the nation on the international sphere, the right to set rules in your own country are not fundamental conservative principles, then I don't know what is. So I think there is an appeal to this, and rightly so, that kind of counterbalances the risk of retaliation. I think a lot depends on how it is done, the care, the strategic thinking, the ability to manage through what will be a complex period, and of course a lot depends on what else is going on at the time.
Now, if we're looking at the wider geopolitics of this, ultimately, James, because the UK has been talking for such a long time about potentially triggering Article 16, shaking up the protocol, those on the EU side like to say they've had plenty of time to get their ducks in a row, to speak to their allies. And one key player here is America. If the UK were to push ahead with this plan, do you think there would be a robust response from the White House?
I think the Americans would be irritated with the British if the British pressed ahead with this. I think on two grounds. One, there is obviously a lot of congressional opinion in the US that that shares the British view that the Good Friday Agreement is more important than the protocol. But the problem for the UK is, they're basically inclined to defer to Dublin on whether the Good Friday Agreement is being honoured or not. And Dublin's view of what the Good Friday Agreement and its relationship to the protocol is radically different from London's, to put it mildly. I think the second point is the White House worries about the broader unity of the West. And when you speak to US figures, one of the concerns that they express about Brexit is that the EU and the UK are going to become like Japan and South Korea, two US allies who fall out at the drop of a hat, and they have to spend huge amounts of time managing the relationship. And I think if the UK and the EU were to start falling out again over the protocol, and I think the White House would consider that the UK, by being the ones who were choosing to act, were the instigators of this, there would be a lot of irritation that, at this moment when the US is trying to ensure Western unity, the EU and the UK, two vital parts of the West, are having this argument which is distracting from that.
David, do you think there could also be an idea building when it comes to the perception of the UK on the world stage, that the UK doesn't follow law, it breaks international law, or do you think that would be misguided?
I don't think there's any serious risk of that. I think anyone who looks at the question can see that the protocol is a very unusual beast created in very specific circumstances. Arguably, we weren't sovereign fully. Well, we weren't sovereign fully when we agreed it. We were under all sorts of pressures. I think an attempt to redo the protocol or put in place a better balance, I don't think tells you anything about the UK attitude to international law more broadly. We've always been a strong supporter of the international rules-based system of international institutions, and I don't see that's going to change. I dare say the Americans will be a bit irritated if the government goes down this road. That's life. Sometimes things the Americans do irritate us. Sometimes things the Europeans do irritate us. But I think there is a wider picture here that has to be managed. I think that Japan, South Korea and Algeria only takes you so far. The difficulty that we have in UK-EU relationships is the protocol. If we can solve the protocol, then there's absolutely no reason why this relationship can't be a lot better. And the last few months have shown the potentialities, and that's why it is so frustrating that we can't move on. But simply acquiescence in the status quo isn't enough. We need to fix it and fix it better.
Now, I want to move on briefly to domestic politics before we end this discussion. But just first, James, just briefly to viewers, what is the timescale then in terms of, we expect in the Queen's speech next week, if the government were to, decide to act on this, what are we looking at?
So I think we'll get words in the Queen's speech about protecting the Good Friday Agreement in its entirety. I think there will then be kind of one last UK attempt to kind of get a negotiation going. I think if that doesn't bear fruit, then I think you will see the UK government saying that it is prepared to legislate and then introducing a bill. But I think all the time trying to say, look, this bill is making it possible for the DUP to have talks about going back into the power sharing executive, and also keep saying to the EU, we are prepared to talk to you, and we'd rather do this by negotiation than legislation. I think one of the really big questions is, how does the House of Lords respond to this bill? And I think that talking to peers, there are two key tests. First of all, how does it pass the Commons? If it passes the Commons with pretty much unanimous Conservative support, the Lords will be more inclined to defer to the elected House. If there is a sizable Tory rebellion over it, they will be less so. The second is, what does the Lords think about whether this is legal under international law? And I think this is going to become a very big argument. Do people accept the UK government argument that this is what I think will be the UK government argument, which is this will be legal. This is legal because the UK is moving to protect the pre-existing international agreement rather than just unilaterally ripping up an agreement because it chooses to. They will argue that they are doing so to protect a pre-existing agreement that has precedence. If that argument convinces the Lords, then I think the bill could well get through the Lords. If it doesn't, and the government ends up having to Parliament Act it, that is going to add at least a year to the process. And I think that becomes much more risky for the government because it A, takes the bill much closer up to the next general election, and also, there is a greater chance that the EU has more time to create a common position, and there's also a chance that the geopolitical environment could change again, and the EU could feel much more comfortable threatening to kind of rip up the entire TCA.
Now, we are speaking on Thursday, and effectively we won't know much about the local election results until early tomorrow morning. So we are limited in what we can say, but just a few brief questions. I first wanted to say, James, is this now a referendum on Boris Johnson's leadership, or has it become more complicated? What's the mood amongst Tory MPs?
So I think that these elections are sufficiently patchy in England, and particularly in Tory-held parts of England, that it isn't going to tell us that much about the wider domestic political scene. I also think that the Tories have done a very good job of getting their expectation management in early. If you talk to Tory MPs, this idea that the loss of 800 seats would be par has got into the bloodstream. While as if you look at some of the election analysis from Stephen Fisher of Oxford University, he thinks that a loss of around 250 odd seats would be much more like par. So you could have a situation where the Tory party has a very bad night, but it is not quite as bad as Tory MPs think, and so they are more relaxed. My instinct, and we should say that we're saying this without knowing the results, is that what these results are going to do is to further the divides that are existing within the Tory parliamentary party. I suspect in the next few weeks that anyone who's got the Lib Dems in second place in their seat is going to be more worried about Boris Johnson continuing as leader, while people who've got a northern or Midland seat with Labour in second place will be less concerned about that. And I think that one of Boris Johnson's advantages is that it is hard to see the candidate to replace him who appeals to both flanks of the new Tory electoral coalition. And I think I think we are probably in for this isn't going to break the stasis in the Tory party.
And David, you've been critical in the past about the direction of this government. I wondered, in recent weeks, we have seen a new number 10 team brought in, new advisors to the Prime Minister, an attempt, I think, to move to the right on various issues such as Rwanda. Are you seeing an improvement?
So I think the ship has been steadied a bit with the new team and a little bit of red meat. I used an analogy when I was writing in something a few weeks ago of it being like the Mary Rose, still a bit top heavy and still a bit vulnerable to sudden manoeuvres, and I think that's still true. I think we need to see a bit more conservative philosophy over the next few months and years if we are to recover from the midterm blues. And I've said what I've said on tax cuts, on energy policy and much besides, and I think we need to just get a bit closer to the natural supporters on this, and some of these problems will start to disappear.
And just finally, David, given we have you here, I can't help but resist to ask. There are rumours abound, reports that you could be lined up for the vacant seat left by Neil Parish, who had to quit the Commons. Could you be tempted with a route to being an MP?
Well, I thought you might ask that. Look, I only just left government, and I left it, because I didn't agree with various things that are being done, and that's still true. There's a lot of speculation around, but I haven't really got anything to say on this subject at the moment. And when I do, I'm sure the Spectator will be the first to know.
Okay, well, we'll rebook that.
We'll hold you to that.
Thank you, David. Thank you, James.